All right, ready for this? Today, we're diving deep, deep into medieval power. You know, knights, castles, the whole 9 yards. And get this, our main source, it's a history guide, but it's actually written for a year 6 student.
Seriously.
Yeah, but trust me, it's got some seriously interesting stuff in there. Don't let that fool you.
It is amazing, though, isn't it, what you can find in those kinds of sources. You know, we
Yeah.
think of medieval times and we just think kings and queens ruling everything, but it was way more dynamic than that.
Totally. It wasn't just about who had the fanciest crown,
Right,
right?
right.
So let's go back, way back, before kings and queens even. Our guide starts with these powerful figures called warlords.
Now, these guys weren't just like brutes swinging swords around, I think more like community leaders, protectors.
Right.
And to get that power, they needed more than just, well, strength.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, they had to prove they were from the right family. They needed to be smart in battle, not just strong. And even gift giving, that was a big deal for keeping their influence.
It's like a medieval popularity contest, but with much higher stakes.
Right.
The guide even talks about how they measured land back then in hides.
Hides.
Yeah, one hide was like enough to support one family.
Yeah.
Can you imagine having to defend your hide from, like, rival warlords?
Wow, yeah. Really shows you how important just owning land was just to survive, even on that small scale.
Right.
But that need for security, for working together, it led to some surprisingly organized systems,
Oh, yeah.
like 100 courts. Imagine families getting together to settle arguments, to make decisions. The Vikings even had their own version. They called them wapentakes.
So even way back then, people were figuring out ways to govern themselves. It wasn't just total chaos.
Exactly.
And speaking of governing, the guide talks about the Winan. That was a council of advisors who helped the king rule.
Oh, the Witan. Yeah, fascinating. These were like the men of knowledge, elders, religious figures, experienced warriors. It really shows you that even back then, those early kings, they knew they couldn't just rule alone. They needed guidance.
So it was always more about collaboration than just one person calling all the shots.
Yeah, from the beginning.
But as those kingdoms grew into what we think of as like classic medieval times, that power structure got even more complicated, right?
Absolutely. And our guide, it lays it out almost like a team effort. All these different players working together, or sometimes all working against each other. At the top, you had the king, obviously. But right alongside him, with huge influence, was the Pope.
Oh, yeah. It's crazy how powerful the church was back then. And it wasn't just about religion, was it? It was like tied into everything, daily life, the whole thing.
Right, think about it. The church, they provided moral guidance, education, even health care. They were like a social safety net. And the Pope, he was the head honcho of this massive institution. He could influence public opinion. He could influence kings, even challenge them sometimes.
So he wasn't just a spiritual leader. He was a major power player.
Oh, absolutely. A major power play.
So we've got the king and the Pope as our team captains. Who else was on this medieval power team? The guide mentions nobles, knights.
Yeah. The nobles, they were like the wealthy elite landowners. Many of them had their own armies even. They could be powerful allies for the king or, potential rivals if their ambitions didn't quite line up. And then you had the knights, the warriors, the protectors, right? Often these knights would serve as vassals.
Wait, vassal, that sounds a little confusing. What's that mean exactly?
Okay. Think of it like a system, all about loyalty and obligation. A vassal was anyone who pledged to serve a lord. Usually that was in exchange for land or for protection.
Yeah.
So a knight might be a vassal to a powerful noble, not directly to the king.
Oh, I see.
It made this really, this complex web of relationships. Who was loyal to who? It got messy.
So the power structure wasn't just a straight line from the king down. It was more like a branching network.
Yeah, very much so.
And of course, we can't forget about the majority of the population.
Yeah.
The peasants.
Right, right. Sadly, the peasants, they had very little power in this whole system. They worked the land, paid their taxes, and generally were expected to just, obey. But as towns started to grow, there was this new group that emerged, merchants. And they had increasing influence.
The power of the purse strings, right? It's interesting how even back then, those early ideas about a market-driven society, they were starting to take root.
Yeah, they really were. But one group sadly remained, largely excluded, women. They were expected to manage the household, obey their husbands, and they had very limited opportunities for leadership.
It definitely shows you how much things have changed, right?
Yeah,
In terms of societal norms.
definitely.
But even with all these different players, I'm guessing the king was still the one calling the shots at the end of the day, right?
Well, he was at the top, yes. But here's the thing. Even the king, he couldn't function without the support, without the cooperation of all these other groups. It was a delicate balance, a web of, interdependence. It all had to work together.
So it sounds like medieval power was uh, less about just force, more about managing all these complicated relationships. But even then, there was more than one way to be powerful, right? Our guide actually breaks down power into different types.
It's true. It wasn't just about being the king or the pope. You had political power, which was about making laws, making decisions. Then there was military power, embodied by the knights, the nobles with their armies. And then there's economic power, and that's where you see the merchants rising. Wealth equals influence. And that's something that, well, that's still true today.
Yeah, and of course, religious power.
Mm-hmm.
The church's ability to shape what people believed, their morals and even the actions of kings. So even in this system that seems so rigid, there were actually multiple ways to have influence, multiple ways to control things.
Many paths to power. And it wasn't always a peaceful competition either.
Yeah.
Medieval history is full of, conflict, betrayals, power grabs. Even the idea of a just ruler, well, that wasn't always a guarantee.
You're saying there were tyrants back then, too.
Oh, yeah, unfortunately. But the fact that this idea of a just ruler existed, it suggests that even then, people understood that power could be, well, that it could be abused. And sometimes those who abused the power, they faced the music.
Like being overthrown by the very people they were supposed to be leading.
Exactly. And that's a powerful message, even for us today, isn't it? So we've got this power team, different types of power, but how did it all actually work? Our guide introduces this thing called the feudal system. And that's where things get interesting. Imagine a ladder. The king is at the top, obviously. Below him, the nobles, then the knights, and at the very bottom, the peasants. But the feudal system, it wasn't just about where you stood on that ladder. It was a whole web of obligations, of responsibilities.
So it wasn't just, I'm the king, so do what I say. There were actual, rules, expectations for everyone.
Absolutely. The king, he provided land and protection to the nobles, and in return, they gave him military service, loyalty. The nobles did the same for the knights, and so on down the line. Everyone had a role to play to keep things stable. And alongside that feudal structure, you had a similar hierarchy within the church itself. The pope at the top, then cardinals, bishops, priests.
Oh, wow. So it's like a whole parallel power structure.
Yeah, very much so. And then you had these fascinating groups called guilds emerging. They were kind of like early versions of labor unions.
Oh, and legit.
Craftsmen would band together, to make sure they got fair wages, fair treatment. Shows that even those further down the ladder, they were finding ways to organize themselves, to assert their rights.
It sounds like medieval society was always adapting, always finding new ways to balance these different sources of power. And with all this complexity, I'm guessing they needed people who could, navigate the legal system. Is that where lawyers came in?
You got it. As the medieval world got more complex, they needed more legal experts. And lawyers, well, they became increasingly influential. They helped settle disputes, advise rulers, helped shape the laws as they evolved.
It's funny how some things never change, huh? Lawyers finding their way into positions of power. That's a tale as old as time.
It really is. But we can't forget about another innovation that completely transformed the medieval world. Gunpowder.
Ah, gunpowder. That was a game changer, wasn't it?
Oh, it was a game changer, literally. It revolutionized warfare, and because of that, it revolutionized the balance of power. Suddenly, those massive stone castles that had stood for centuries, well, they were vulnerable to cannons.
Wow.
Gunpowder shifted the advantage to whoever could afford to produce those new weapons, to use them. Kings with cannons, well, they had a big edge over anyone who was still relying on, on the old ways of fighting.
So in a way, gunpowder actually centralized power, put more of it back in the hands of those at the very top. It's fascinating how technology can have such a huge impact on power dynamics. And it's a reminder that those dynamics are always changing, always being shaped by everything from major conflicts to well, to seemingly small innovations.
It's true. The medieval world wasn't frozen in time. It was dynamic, ever-changing. And that's what makes studying it so, so intriguing. It gives us a look into the complexities of power, how you get it, how you keep it, and ultimately how it's challenged.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Kings, popes, plagues, gunpowder. It's almost overwhelming to think about how all these different factors came together and shaped history.
It really is a lot to take in. But before we get too lost in the weeds, let's take a moment to digest all this. When we come back, we'll wrap things up and explore some of the key takeaways from our deep dive into the world of medieval power. A world that, well, that was always changing.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork here. Kings, popes, knights, the whole medieval power team, right? But as we were saying before, this wasn't some like static system. Things were always in motion.
Always changing, yeah. It's like a dance, almost. Different partners taking the lead, sometimes gracefully, sometimes stepping on toes. That's what these power shifts felt like.
So our guide talks about the rise of nation states and how that was a real game changer. What does that even mean? And how did it shake things up?
Okay, so think back to those early kingdoms, right? They were often pretty small, centered around a local lord. But as these areas grew, they started combining with others. And people, they began to identify less with their little village and more with this bigger entity, this nation.
So like their sense of belonging shifted
Yeah.
from local to something much bigger, more unified.
Exactly. And that new sense of national identity, it started to challenge the old feudal system. Loyalty to a king, well, it wasn't the only game in town anymore.
It's like the rules of the game were being rewritten
Yeah.
right there in the middle of it all. And speaking of rewriting rules, our guide talks about some pretty intense conflicts, things that really show these power struggles. One that stands out is King Henry II versus Thomas Becket.
Oh, yeah, Henry and Becket. That wasn't just a disagreement. That was a full-on showdown. The monarchy versus the church. Henry, he wanted to control the church courts, basically saying royal law was more important than religious law.
But Becket, he was the Archbishop of Canterbury, right? He wasn't just going to back down.
No, not at all. He saw this as an attack on the church's independence, on its authority. It was a battle of wills. Neither one would budge.
And as our guide points out, this conflict ended in tragedy. Becket was murdered in his own cathedral.
It's a chilling reminder of just how far these power struggles could go, how violent they could get.
A somber moment in history, yeah. But what's interesting is the guide says that Becket's death actually, it ended up strengthening the church's position.
It did, yeah. There was so much public outrage that Henry, he had to back down. He had to give up on many of his demands.
So even in death, Becket achieved a kind of victory for the church. It shows that taking a stand, even against huge power, can have unexpected consequences.
Yeah, big time. And speaking of standing up to power, there's the Magna Carta. This is where a group of nobles, they basically forced King John to sign this document, a document that limited his own power.
Wait, they forced the king to sign something. That's incredible. What did the Magna Carta actually change?
It was this groundbreaking legal document. It established a huge principle that even the king, he was subject to the law. He couldn't just rule however he wanted. It guaranteed certain rights to the nobility, things like due process, protection from being imprisoned unjustly.
Wow. It sounds like they were like planting the seeds of democracy right there, back in medieval England.
You could say that. The Magna Carta was a pivotal moment. The rule of law, the idea that everyone, even the king, had to follow the rules, well, it was a huge shift, a shift that would echo through history. Now let's shift gears a little bit here. Let's talk about something that, well, on the surface it seems totally unrelated to power struggles, the Black Death.
The plague. But that was a pandemic, a devastating one. Millions of people died. How could that have anything to do with power?
It's one of those strange twists of history. Think about it. The Black Death, it wiped out a huge chunk of Europe's population, and a lot of those who died, they were peasants, the people who worked the land.
Okay, fewer workers. I think I see where you're going with this.
Right. With fewer people to work the land, the peasants who survived, well, suddenly they had a lot more leverage. They were in high demand. And that meant they could demand higher wages, better treatment. They could even start to challenge that whole feudal order, the system that kept them tied to the land.
So a tragedy on a massive scale actually ended up giving more power to those who had almost none before. It's like Like someone hit the reset button on the whole social and economic structure?
That's a great way to put it. The Black Death was horrible. There's no way around that.
Okay.
But it did lead to the decline of feudalism. It pushed Europe towards a more fluid, dynamic society. It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, change can come about in the most unexpected ways.
Okay, so we've got kings clashing with the church, rebellious nobles, a pandemic that reshaped society. Medieval power, it clearly wasn't a straight line, was it? More like a winding path full of twists and turns. Winding and unpredictable, that's for sure. And those twists and turns, they weren't just about these big dramatic events either. They were also shaped by everyday things, innovations, shifts in how people thought. For example, our guide talks about how the role of courts changed. They started as just the king's advisors, but they evolved into something much more formal, much more structured.
It's like they were building the very foundation of government, right? With procedures, with officials who were responsible for different parts of how things were run.
Exactly. And that growing complexity, well, it created a need for new kinds of expertise. Lawyers, for example, they became more and more important, helping to settle legal disputes, advising the rulers on matters of law.
Funny how some things never change, right? Lawyers finding their way into positions of power. A classic tale. But we can't forget another innovation, one that really transformed the medieval world. Gunpowder. Ah, yes. Gunpowder. That was a game changer, literally. It completely changed how wars were fought, and because of that, it changed who had the power. Suddenly, those big, strong castles, the ones that had stood for centuries, well, cannons could take them down.
It's almost like someone invented a Death Star and blew up the planet. Okay, maybe not that dramatic, but
Yeah.
but you get the idea.
Yeah, I get it. Gunpowder, it gave the advantage to whoever could afford to make those weapons, to use them. Kings with cannons, they had a huge advantage over anyone who was still using the old ways of fighting.
So it actually kind of centralized power again, put more of it back into the hands of those at the top. It's amazing, isn't it, how technology can have such a massive impact on who holds the power. And it's a good reminder that those dynamics, they're never set in stone. They're always shifting, shaped by everything from wars to what seem like small changes.
Absolutely. The medieval world, it was a dynamic system, always evolving.
Yeah.
And that's what makes studying it so fascinating, so intriguing. It gives us a glimpse into the complexities of power, how it's gained, how it's held onto, and in the end, how it's challenged.
So we've covered a lot of ground: kings, popes, plagues, gunpowder. It's almost a lot to process, thinking about how all these different things interacted, how they shaped history.
It is a lot to take in. But before we get too bogged down in all the details, let's take a moment to really absorb it all. When we come back, we'll wrap things up and we'll explore some of the key takeaways from our deep dive into this world of medieval power, a world that was always in flux.
All right, so I don't know about you, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around all that. Kings, popes, plagues, gunpowder. Medieval power was, well, it was anything but simple.
It really was a fascinating mix, wasn't it? All these different people, different forces, all trying to get power, to hold on to it. But as we finish up our deep dive, I think it's a good time to step back and ask ourselves, what did we learn? How does any of this connect to us, to our lives today?
Yeah, that's a good point. After all, we don't live in a world of castles and knights anymore, right? But our guide does end with this really interesting question. It asks us to imagine ourselves living back then and to think about what kind of power we would want.
It's a great way to get us thinking about the different sides of power, and what really fits with what we value, what's important to us.
Okay, so I'll play along. If I was suddenly dropped into medieval society, I think I'd be drawn to the power of knowledge.
Yeah.
Imagine being a scholar, trusted advisor, like those guys in the Witan. You could influence decisions, but with wisdom, with insight.
That's a great choice. It really speaks to how powerful knowledge is, how powerful expertise can be, even in a world that seems like it's all about, force and military strength.
Plus, let's be honest, I'd probably get to wear a really cool robe, maybe have my own secret library filled with old scrolls. Who wouldn't want that?
Right. But seriously, this thought experiment, it helps us see that power isn't just one thing. It's not one size fits all. It's not just about being a king or commanding an army.
Yeah, it's about finding ways to make a difference, to use whatever influence you have to make things better for yourself, for the people around you.
Exactly. And that's a lesson that's, it's timeless, isn't it? Whether you're talking about medieval kings or everyday people today, the responsibility that comes with power, it's the same.
So as we wrap up our look at medieval power, I think the biggest takeaway is that it's a story about constant change, about adaptation. Things never stayed the same for long,
Mm.
and even the most powerful people, they had to deal with a whole web of relationships, of challenges.
That's a great way to put it. And for everyone listening, I think the key thing to remember is to think about the different kinds of power that exist in your own lives. What are you good at? What areas do you have influence in? How can you use those things to make a positive impact in your community, at work, even just within your own family?
Because even though we don't have knights and castles anymore, those dynamics of power, of influence, they're still all around us.
They are, and by understanding them, we can be more effective, more responsible. And in the end, we can be more empowered as individuals. Even what seems like a small action, it can have a ripple effect. You can create positive change that goes way beyond just you.
Well said. So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep those minds engaged. Who knows what other fascinating deep dives are waiting for us out there?